Within Power Automate Desktop, there is an action called loop that allows you to execute the same series of statements over and over again. This can be very, very advantageous in the flow. And in this video, I'll teach you all the conditions and all the ways to use a loop within your flows. Let's learn. Okay, so let's start with a basic loop. You'll find all of the loop statements under the loops folder. I open the loops folder here, and you'll see that there are a number of actions, but the one we're going to pay attention to first is just a simple loop. So I'm going to click and drag that onto my canvas. And the properties page is going to ask us for 3 pieces of information. Let's say, for example, we want this to loop 5 times. So what we can say is we want to start from 1 and then end to 5. So we say 1 to 5. There's the third parameter that's specified. What is the increment? You can specify any number that you want, but normally what you would specify is 1. So what it's basically saying is go up by 1. So 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5. Put in a 1 there. And then what it's going to do is it's going to produce a variable called loop index. That is the current number of the loop. Starts at 1, and then after it hits 5, it ends. So that's where the number that it's currently on is stored in loop index. I'm going to click save. And now what it's done is it's created 2 statements. The first statement is the loop itself. This is the condition, and then the end statement. So whatever happens that's between those 2 statements will iterate that number of times. And in this case, we're going to iterate it through 5 times. So what I'm going to do is I want to have it so that it's going to, every time it goes through its loop, it's just going to display a message box. So I'm going to search for the word message so that I can quickly find my message, display message action. Right here, I'm going to click it and drag it between the loop and the end statement. Now what I want to do is simply just have a message box come up and then display what the current value of the loop index is. So I'm going to say loop index equals, and then I can specify the variable loop index itself. And then click save. So now what happens when I run this, a message box will appear every time it goes through its loop. So I'm going to hit run. And the first time it goes through, the number of the loop index should be specified as a 1. So I'm going to run it, and the display message will come up. Loop index equals 1. If I click the OK button, it's going to go to the top, increment the loop index by 1, and now the loop index is 2, and then so on. 3, 4, and then 5. So then after it's done that statement, the loop index will now increment it again, but because now the value is 6, it doesn't satisfy the condition anymore. It's at 1 to 5. So now it'll do its evaluation and say, oh, I'm done, and it'll immediately go to the end statement. And as soon as it does that, the flow is complete. So that's a simple example of doing a loop where the number is increasing. Start at 1 and then end at 5. However, the loop index also allows you to go the reverse way. Say I wanted to start at 5 and count down to 1. So if I go back to the loop statement, and I can say I want to specify the start from to be 5 and then end to number 1. So it'll go 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then finish. However, what we have to do is we have to change the increment by value. Instead of increasing it by 1, we want to subtract it by 1. So I put a negative sign in front of the 1, click save. And now what it should do is almost exactly the same thing as what was done in the previous example, but now it's going to say 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So let's run it. First display message will show up. It'll say that the loop index is equal to 5. And then I'll just click OK. It's 5. And then 4, 3, and then 2 and 1. So it's sort of the same example, except instead of increasing it, we're now decreasing the increments. Okay, so now I'm going to go through an example of using a statement called loop condition. Slightly different than what we've done before. The loop condition allows you to specify the condition a little bit differently. So before we begin, I'm going to clean the canvas. I'll delete what I've got so far. If I go back into the loops folder, you'll see that there is a statement called loop condition. Now, before I do that, I'm going to have to create a variable called counter. So just bear with me for one moment while I do that, and it'll make sense in a moment why I'm doing this. So I click set variable. I'm going to create a counter. The counter is what's going to be used to control the loop. So I'm going to say counter with a value of 1, starting point of 1. I click save to that. And now if I go back and I go back to my loop condition, I'm going to click and drag that underneath my counter. What it's going to present me with now is it's going to say, well, what is the first operand and what is the second operand? The first operand is going to be my counter. Starts at 1, and then it's going to I'm going to have it so that it increments by 1 as well. And then the operator is going to say, when do you want it to stop? Okay, and I'll give you an example of that. So if I say that the counter, and I want the counter to stop when it's less than or equal to 5. Well, I can say on the operator, not equal to, I can say less than or equal to. So, and then the value of 5. So it's going to be less than or equal to. And I'm going to click on save on that. So then what I do is I'm going to put another message box under here. And display message. And what I want to display is counter equals, and then the variable counter. All right. And then what I have to do is one extra step is because if I don't add this extra step, because I'm not incrementing the counter is always going to be 1. So it just can continuously loop, and it's going to be infinite loop. So what I have to do is after every time it does the display message, it has to increment the value of counter by 1. And I'll increase the variable and click and drag that underneath here. The variable that I want to increase is the counter variable. And increase by 1. So this is more or less what we did before with the other basic loop. So if I run this again, it's going to set the counter value to 1. And then the loop condition at the top says, whenever counter is less than or equal to 5, continue to go. So counter equals 1, and then 2, 3, 4, and then 5. And then now that counter is going to has a value of 6, as you can see right here, it no longer meets the condition at the top where is 6 less than or equal to 5? No, it's not. So then it breaks out of the loop. In addition, within the loop condition or even a basic loop, what you can do is there's another statement that you can use that says exit loop. For some situations, you may be in the middle of a loop, and maybe the condition hasn't been met yet. It hasn't, in this example here, the counter hasn't reached 5, but maybe there's another condition within your statements that cause you to want to exit the loop immediately, maybe an error condition or some other condition that's occurred. So if I go back to the loops folder, you'll notice that there's a statement called exit loop. So with exit loop, I can put that anywhere within the loop condition and the end statement. And basically, I'm going to put it right underneath right after it starts here. And what this will do, essentially, is it'll set my variable to counter of equal to 1. It'll go to the first statement, which is the loop condition, which will be true. And then as soon as it hits this exit loop, it'll immediately go to the end. This is just an example, but there might be situations where you want to be able to exit a loop before it actually hits the condition that exits the loop normally. Let me run this. Now, within Power Automate, normally what you can do is you can hit the run button, and what it'll do is it'll fly through the statements or whatever. But you can also run by running the next action. Basically allows you to do one step at a time. So I'm going to hit that just so that we can see when it goes through the different actions. So the first action it's going to hit is it's going to hit action number 1, which is it's going to set the variable to, or to set the counter to a value of 1. Now I'm going to execute that. You can either hit the run next action button or you can hit F10 on your keyboard. So I'm just going to hit F10. So that it does the first statement. It sets my counter to equal 1, and now it's at the loop condition. Is counter less than or equal to 5? Yes, it is. So it will enter the loop. So it'll do statement number 2. And then it says exit loop right away. So what it's going to do now is it's going to jump over any of the statements beneath it and go right down to the end statement, which is on statement number 6. So if I hit F10, you can see it goes to the end statement right away. And I hit F10 again, the flow is now complete. So there's an example of using an exit loop to exit your loop before the condition is met at the top. So another statement that you can use within your loop is an action called next loop. Let me show you how that works. Under the loops folder, you can see that there's a statement called next loop. What next loop essentially will do is within your loop statements, as soon as it hits the next loop, it'll automatically go right back up to the top. So it'll skip any statements that are below the next loop and the end statement. Skip all of those and then immediately go back up to the top. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the next loop just after it's incremented the counter. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to duplicate this display message. I'm going to put it right underneath here. And I'm just going to say, hello world. Okay. All right, so now what I'll do is I'll step through this one action at a time by hitting the F10. But what will happen here is that it's going to enter the loop condition where initially the counter is going to be equal to a value of 1. I'll take out the exit loop, and then it's going to it'll display the message indicating what the current counter is. It'll increase the counter, but when it hits the next loop, it won't have a chance to execute this statement, which is the display message. When it hits the next loop, it will immediately go back up to the loop condition and then test it again, and then loop continuously until this condition is met, and then it'll hit the end statement. So let's run this. So counter is equal to 1. We expected that. I'm going to click OK. And now it never got a chance to execute the statement number 6. And what I'll do is I'm just going to F10 here. Equals 4, equals 5. And then it's finished. So that's an example where there might be a situation within your flow where you want to be able to continue with the loop, but there may be a situation where you wanted to abruptly not exit or execute any statements below the next loop, and it'll continue the top until the condition is met. Within Power Automate Desktop, there's another variant of a loop called for each. Let me give you an example of what for each will do. For each essentially allows you to loop through either a list, and a list is a variable that has multiple items in it. I'll show you that right now. And then you can also, with the for each statement, iterate through a data table. And now a data table is similar to like an Excel spreadsheet, but within Power Automate Desktop. I'll give you an example of that as well. So before I begin, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a list, and then I'll show you how we can use the for each statement. So I'll be right back within a moment. I'm just going to type this in, save a lot of time. I'll be right back. Okay, so what I've done here is I've created a simple list, and the list is called colors. And within that list, I'm adding 3 colors to it: red, green, and blue. When I run this, and mind you, I've created another video that you'll see on the screen right now that deal with how to deal with lists. But essentially what I'm doing is I'm telling Power Automate to create a variable called colors and add 3 values to it, red, green, and blue. So if I go to my flow variables, I can double click on it and you can see now it's added red, green, and blue. Now, within the loops folder, there's a statement called for each. For each allows you to iterate through a list or a data table. Now what I'm going to do is, because I've created my list, I want to iterate through the list that I just created. So then I can say for each, I can bring it down here, and that's going to say, well, what is the thing you want to iterate through? Well, the variable that I want to iterate through is my list called colors. So that with my variable picker, click on that, click on colors, and what it's going to do is it's going to store it into another variable. Every time it goes through the list, one by one, it's going to store whatever is in there into that variable. Currently, it's called current item, but I'm just going to call it, it is just basically a color. And then it's completed the for each. So for each color that's in colors. So it's going to assign the value that is currently on to the variable called color. And now I'll display a message. And display message. I'm going to drag it in here. And this is just another way of looping through a list. So the message I want to display is essentially the color. Okay. Now when I run it, I'm going to get 3 dialog boxes that are going to pop up. First it's going to say red, then it's going to say green, and then it'll say blue. So let me run it. So starts at the top, creates my new list called colors, adds 3 items to it, and it's going to read from the top the first one. It says red, that's the current value of color, and then it's going to loop through, go to the top, and get the next one. The next one is green, and then the next one is blue. Now, but because there's only 3 items within my colors variable, my colors list, it's done. So it only did it 3 times. If I added a 4th one, I'm just going to copy and make the color yellow. Now what it's going to do is it's going to, when it goes through and starts up, creates the list. Now it's going to iterate through 4 times. First one, it's going to be red, second, green, blue, and then yellow. So red, green, blue, and yellow. So that's how you can use a different kind of a loop, but for either a list or a data table. In this case, we used it for a list. Okay, so for this final example, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stay on using the for each, but instead of using a list, I'm going to use a data table. Now, what I alluded to before is the data table is sort of like an Excel spreadsheet within Power Automate. It's got columns and it's got rows. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this list. And then the data table, to be able to create data tables, it's under the variables folder. Data table, create new data table. And I'm going to add my very first statement up there. So before I go into adding data into my data table, the variable that it produces, the data table variable that I want to store it in is going to be called, by default, it's called data table, but I want to override that and call it colors. Similar to the list that I had before. And then click on edit. By default, what it does is it creates 2 columns and the first row. I really am only interested in just having 1 column, so I can actually click and delete this. I just want the 1 column, but I want to have 3 rows. So the first one is going to be red. Second element is going to be green. The third element is blue. And then save. Now, instead of using a list now, we're using a data table. I just happen to be calling it the same variable that I called my previous example where you called it colors. My data table is called colors. Everything is exactly the same as before though. It's going to go through each one of the rows that are in my data table, and then it's going to specify the color for each one of the elements. So now when I hit run, it's going to display a dialog box, again, with the colors that I've specified: red, green, and blue. So there's the first one, green, and then finally blue. Now, similar to what it did before, if I wanted to add a fourth one, all I'd have to do is go into my data table, edit it, add a fourth row, and call it yellow. So the for each loop is dynamic enough to know that it should go through and iterate as many times that there's rows within that data table. So now when I hit the run, same rules applies as it did before, is that it'll create the new data table called colors, and now it's going to iterate through whatever number of rows that are inside that data table. It just happens to be 4 right now. So now it'll be red, and then green, blue, and then finally yellow. So those are just a few examples of using loops within Power Automate Desktop. If you have a question or a comment, feel free to drop me a line in the comment section below. And don't forget to like and subscribe, because I love hearing all your comments, and I'd love to be able to get your input and feedback so that I can continue to produce more videos.